biggest challenges in creating impactful landscape photography images is overcoming one major obstacle. You're taking a three-dimensional scene, something with natural depth and separation, and you're putting it on a flat, two-dimension piece of paper or computer screen. In this video, I'm going to share with you the secret to creating that depth in your landscape photography. Now, this is something I struggled with. I would be in a beautiful landscape, take my images, but then when I got home on the computer, they just fell flat. Literally. Now, over time, I found that there are a few things that completely change this for me. The first is light or atmospheric conditions. Now, these things we can't control, but we can use them to our advantage if we understand how both of these elements can affect the landscape. Bad light or light that doesn't complement the subject can absolutely ruin your photo. Now, let's take a look at an example. Now, this photo in the Grand Canyon was taken just after the sun went down. This time of day usually gives some beautiful colors in the skies, but the choice of the subject doesn't go well with these conditions. Everything in the landscape is the same tonal value and color. This sweeping ridge, it's an interesting subject, and of course it's the Grand Canyon, so this is absolutely epic. But because I chose light that doesn't complement that sweeping ridge, you can't separate it from the canyon behind it. This looked fantastic when I was there. I could see the depth and the natural separation with my eyes, but it falls flat in a photo. Now take this same subject, same composition, but I took it with the sun still above the horizon. Now you have that light that creates the depth to the image. The light hitting that ridge is causing separation from the canyon behind it. Now it's looking more three-dimensional. So you have a wide range of tonal values separating the layers of the landscape. You have the darker shadows down in the canyon where the light isn't touching. You have some soft diffuse light on the canyon walls, and down in the middle of the canyon you have the subject, which is the brightest and most contrasty part of the scene. Now let's take a look at another example. This sunset photo in Joshua Tree is a perfect example of letting the light create the depth in your image. Everything is being backlit, that soft light is creating that separation from this main tree and the mountains in the background. But it's also creating separation between the trees in the background and the mountain. Now, if I had waited until the sun went down and tried to get a colorful sky, this main subject might look okay because it's skylined, but you would lose all of that separation between the other trees and the background mountains. Now, one of the misnomers I hear all the time is that your eye is drawn to the brightest part of the image. But that's not always true. It's actually more accurate to say that the eye is drawn to the highest contrast areas of the photo. And this image is a perfect example of that. The dark silhouette trees contrasting with the golden light is what your eye is being drawn to, not just the light. Now let's talk about atmospheric conditions and the holy grail of landscape photography, low clouds and fog. Now in this image I took in the redwoods, I think I have a pretty strong composition. The trees are definitely an interesting subject. I have a nice leading line, but there's still something missing in the photo. Something that would take this photo from good to great. And that is the ever elusive fog, a landscape photographer's best friend. Now here I have a very similar composition. The subject is the same, but it's the atmospheric conditions that change the look, the mood, and the overall quality of the image. If you guys watch this video, you know I was going nuts when this was happening. Now I live in Arizona. We don't get fog in the desert very often, so when I do, I absolutely lose my mind. But you can see that the trees now have separation and the transition from the dark contrast near the camera, it gets lighter and more atmospheric as you get further away. So you combine that with the leading line of the trail, and now you have a clear path for the eye to follow through the image. Now let's take a look at something that is within our control, and that is composition. How can we create separation intentionally? We've seen a few examples already with the leading lines, but let's take a look at some other techniques. Now this photo here is an interesting one. We have the elements that create depth. We have soft light, we have beautiful fog to create separation, and an interesting subject. So what's wrong? Well, technically nothing, I guess, but it can be improved compositionally. Instead of taking a straightforward, simple portrait of the tree, try adding some depth by using some of the trees around it. Give context to the tree. See it as an environmental portrait. Show its place in the landscape. These other cypress trees are framing the subject and leading the eye from both sides down into the middle. Again, the first image isn't necessarily wrong. In fact, I like the image, but by widening my view a little bit, it helps the viewer understand the place this tree has in its environment. It's more of a story rather than just a portrait of the tree. Now in this image, there were a few elements to arrange to create some of the separation. Now I had to change my perspective, getting the right height with my tripod to make sure that the rocks in the foreground didn't cross the reflection. I'm also not giving too much room in the middle of the photo to just blue water. Now I didn't care too much about some of these rocks here in the reflection. They weren't really appealing to me, so having the reflection cover them up made it look better in my opinion. I'm just making sure that all of the elements were separated and given equal weight. That to me was important. Now let's talk about settings. How can we create depth with camera settings? Well, one is easy. It's in the name, depth of field. Using our aperture, I think a lot of us, myself included, we get obsessed with getting the images sharp from front to back. But having a shallow depth of field can make a big difference when creating depth. Now, in full disclosure, this photo was taken by my wife, Chris. And for those of you who've been watching for a while, you know that she usually takes the better photos on our trips. Anyway, the shallow depth of field she used here gives that much needed separation from the subject, these beautiful trees with that beautiful pop of color in the flowers, and then the trees in the background. Compositionally, it's working too because these two trees in the water are not intersecting with the main subject. Now this photo here that I took uses the same concept, using a shallow depth of field to separate the subject from the background. Now let's not forget shutter speed. One of the most important concepts in seascape photography is showing the relationship between what's moving and what isn't. Now creating depth with this relationship is extremely important. Your eye is drawn to the contrast here. The contrast or transition from the rough rocks to the smooth water. Using a really long shutter speed to smooth out the texture in moving water just gives that added depth that is different from what you see with your eye. Just remember, you're taking a three-dimensional scene and you're putting it on a two-dimensional piece of paper or computer screen. You have to make conscious decisions to make those images appear three-dimensional to the viewer. If you're interested in our vlogs from the cypress photos you saw in this video, click here and we'll see you in the next one.